Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's hard to imagine what you could say in 15 minutes that's meaningful, but the other speakers have done a pretty good job, so I'll do my best to also contribute in a small way. I want to start by telling you a story of a security issue that my team was tracking a few weeks ago. You may have seen it. It's a vulnerability in a piece of software called WebAdmin, or Webmin. It's a remote administration tool for Linux systems. It's very common. It's been around for a very long time. And a vulnerability was disclosed in this platform that is exploitable, although it may look a bit like a mess. It's exploitable with a one-line Linux command. Right? So what you're seeing on this screen is the attacker typing in the Linux command that's required to attack the system. At the bottom, he's got his listener or a command and control system. And what you see now is the exploit triggering. And as you can see from that screenshot, the attacker has, via that one-line Linux command, has remote root access to the vulnerable machine. And is that a big deal? Well, we set out to do a little bit of analysis. These are Shodan results for vulnerable systems in the UK and South Africa from about 2 weeks ago. And there are about 4,000 exposed systems that could be compromised in this way at the time of this vulnerability being disclosed. And these kinds of issues bite us, and they bite us in very real ways, as we saw with Equifax, and as we've seen over and over again. The simple error, the simple omission of not identifying this problem on an exposed system somewhere, finding the patch, deploying the patch in time, leads to compromise, and compromise leads to breach, and breach leads to penalties, and it gets very ugly because of this one small thing. I want to say one more thing about this vulnerability, which is why we were looking at it and why we found it so interesting, is that the vulnerability in question didn't occur by accident. It was introduced by an outside attacker into the Webmin code. So somebody hacked Webmin systems and introduced this deliberate vulnerability in order to expose these 4,000 systems to be compromised elsewhere. Even more complex, they didn't compromise the code itself, they compromised the build systems. So the systems that take the source code and package it up into the software that we download. So when Webmin analyzed their own source code, they couldn't even see the bug in the source code. They had to kind of reverse from the packages down to the source code to find where the issue was. What this illustrates to me is kind of what I'm trying to capture in this picture, which is just the massive level of complexity and fluidity and, frankly, chaos that I think we have to deal with every day in our day jobs. And I think this sort of complexity and this sort of level of exposure to diverse kinds of threats makes our jobs extremely difficult and places us in a reality where we're generally just dealing with chaos. You know, and vendors will stand up here and try and share with you that that we have solutions that can address these different problems, and it's true, the solutions can address those problems. But in truth, this is not a linear thing. This is not a problem that's addressed with cause and effect. This is an issue that requires us to be comfortable and operate in an environment where everything is changing all the time, and we have to be able to assess and adapt to those changes and at a very, very fast pace. Of course, we have solutions. We have lots of solutions we can sell you. At InfoSec in London this year, there were about 480 vendors who've got something to sell you, something that should solve one of these problems. But despite that, we see that these breaches are still happening. Right? These compromises are still happening, and they're happening at an accelerating rate with increasing consequences, literally as we watch, despite all the effort, despite all the brain power that goes into solving these problems. So one of the things that my team and I did was we looked back in 2018 at what we considered very ad hoc, very informal research, but at the sort of what we considered to be the major breaches that were publicized during that year. And we try to map them to these 8 categories of, if you like, security failures, eight sort of core causes of security failure, and try to see how relevant our messaging as a business is to those issues. In other words, if that victim had bought and implemented something we were selling, would it have made a meaningful difference in mitigating that breach? We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to jump into a couple of them. The first thing we saw was that 42% of those breaches, of the major breaches in 2018, involved effectively web applications. So custom-built applications built by the business themselves, exposed onto the internet, having some sort of security flaw, SQL injection, authentication bypass, something like that. And you'll see some big names got hit because of breaches because of errors like that during 2018. The next one we saw was stopping known exploits. That's kind of like this Webman problem. That's where there's a vulnerability. We know the vulnerability is exploitable, but the business fails to identify and patch the exposed systems. Not a particularly significant proportion, but still at least 3 of those big breaches of about 30 involved exactly that kind of problem. Insecure endpoints. So this is your typical kind of spear phishing attack where something is dropped onto an endpoint, probably via a waterhole attack or spear phishing. That constituted about 21% of the 30 that we looked at. Weak authentication, and a couple of the speakers have spoken about it already. Passwords coming up in almost half of the major breaches in 2018. So despite our understanding the problem, despite the education around it, this continues to bite us. I'll be talking about this more during a session at 11:30 today if you're interested. And then there's a category that we call Know Your Enemy, Know Yourself, which is about intelligence that we like to track. And this speaks to the fact that the victim either could have anticipated what the attacker was going to do, because, for example, it's a known campaign using known malware, or there was advice from the NCSC that spoke to the issue, or the victim should have known something about themselves. For example, that the system that was compromised involved shadow IT. Right? Then we would categorize it under Know Your Enemy, Know Yourself. And that was about 30% of the breaches could have been prevented if the victim had just been a bit more aware of what was going on in the space. And that brings me to the notion of what we call threat intelligence or security intelligence. Which is this idea that we can stand up to these overwhelming odds. We can kind of face down this raging bull if we become a little bit more aware of what's going on in the environment around us and adapt ourselves accordingly. It's a concept I became aware of a few years ago. When I heard it the first time, it confused me a lot, but I've sort of been wrestling with it for a while now, and I think it's starting to percolate for me a little bit. Notionally, the idea is that if we can anticipate what the bad guy is going to do, then we can invest our resources, we can focus our energies accordingly, and therefore use fewer resources, fewer energy to counter what the adversary is doing. Like so many things in security, it's a strong idea, it's a good idea, but I think it gets misrepresented and it gets badly sold, generally in a commodity type form. But I have a view on intelligence-led security that I think can contribute. This is kind of formed by some of my experiences within secure data over the last few years. I think how it works in security is we start off with this threat landscape. This is the sum of all the things that we should be worried about. Everything from attacks against the endpoint to users disclosing confidential information on cloud services. It's a big thing. And it's difficult to understand everything we need to be worried about. So what we do is we go to a vendor and we buy something to counter one of those risks. Those things that we buy generally work. They generally solve the problem that they assert that they're going to solve. The problem is that they don't cover that entire threat landscape. So when you see these breaches happening, they're not happening where the security controls are in place. They're happening where the security controls are not in place. So businesses like Secure Data will then sell you something else. We'll say, well, come and let us do a risk assessment or a security assessment or a pen test for you, and we'll show you where these technologies aren't working. And again, generally, I run a pen testing team. They will do that. They will show you a place where your security controls are failing. But of course, they have a week or 2 weeks. And so those other places where your security controls could also fail aren't being addressed. They sort of get layered on top of each other. So we'll sell you a detection service. We need to have MDR, right? We need We need to pick up where the security failures are happening by monitoring. But of course, we generally only monitor what we know. So again, we're stacking this third layer on top of the other layers instead of around them where these compromises happen. And so then finally, we put response in place because we anticipate that we haven't covered everything off. And we want to know what's happened when it happens, and we want to be able to move quickly in response. Now, that notionally also kind of works. You'll see in my picture, I've sort of left some edges uncovered, right? That's why breaches are still happening. But there's a bigger problem, which is that on top of us having to understand what the attacker does, we also have to understand what our attack surface looks like. And in complex businesses that are exposed in this multifaceted ways, that can be a very difficult thing to do. And one of the reasons why it's difficult is because we as professionals are taught to think in lists. And with respect to what people like the NCSE and other standard bodies do, is they give us checklists, and that's great. Checklists help us to cover off the basics. But attackers don't think through checklists. Attackers don't have a list of things to try against your business. Attackers understand that IT manifests as a network. Things are interconnected in very complex and sometimes unpredictable ways. And it's those networks that the adversary is exploiting. It's the way things interconnect that's being exploited by the bad guy. And a very simple example of this is the difference between understanding your technical environment as something that's boundaried, that has a perimeter. There's an inside and an outside, and we can put a wall and a gate in to protect it, versus how the attacker would understand your environment, which is really as a network of pipes and tunnels. And the one will ultimately lead to the other if they just have enough time and enough energy to try it. And again, in my presentation later today, I'll speak and give you some examples of how this actually plays out during an attack. So when it comes to security intelligence, my assertion is, and this is maybe my big takeaway, that whilst it is valuable for us to understand what the attacker is doing in terms of threat intelligence, what are the IOCs, the things we get from CISP, and we contribute and participate, and it's a great program. Those things are valuable, but if you don't understand yourself as a business, if you don't understand how you're exposed, what your unique threat model looks like, where you're vulnerable and not vulnerable, if you don't practice so that you know yourself in combat, if you don't practice what it's like when ransomware hits, using those test in the box ideas. Those things are invaluable to understanding yourself, and in understanding yourself, I think, is how we start to assert an advantage over the adversary in this very kind of complex reality that we operate in. So I think intelligence really has a above-the-line component, what I would call, and a below-the-line component. The above-the-line component is to do with understanding the adversary. What are their TTPs? What are the techniques they're using? What are the tools? What are the vulnerabilities that they're exploiting? But the below-the-line component is about knowing yourself. It's about understanding how your business manifests in the eyes of the adversary. And I think in simple terms, that can break down to knowing your vulnerabilities. So where are you exposed, and what kinds of weaknesses do you have on those systems? And then knowing what's happening in your environment through telemetry, right? Understanding your environment well enough so that when something strange happens, you can recognize it and respond. This is a quote from Sun Tzu. Tech guys like to quote Sun Tzu. And he speaks about knowing yourself and knowing your enemy and being undefeated in 1,000 battles. And I think it's the knowing yourself bit that I'm trying to drive home today. So if you have this kind of intelligence, simply having it isn't enough. What you need to do is you need to have that intelligence funneled into a process that somehow ingests it, analyzes it, and tries to understand what that means for your environment so you can respond accordingly. And that process, I think, needs to be formalized and structured and disciplined in your environment. And if you can do that, if you can take in these sources of data, really ingest them and consider them in a formal way, I think what you get is a balance between consistency and agility. Agility to respond to things as they change, but consistency so that you maintain the basics over time. And I think that combination is what gives us an advantage over the adversary that thrives in an environment of chaos. So in summary, I think that we're in a reality where we're dealing with overwhelming odds. If you think back to the web admin example, I mean, it's something that's really stacked against you, right? When a supply chain, when a vendor gets compromised in that way. I think that applying the notion, the principles of intelligence-led security can help tip the scales in your advantage, to your advantage. But the real advantage you have over the adversary in this context is the home field advantage, is the ability, the opportunity you have to understand your own environment in a way that the adversary can't understand their environment. And so when we think about intelligence as part of the security process, my message to you this morning is that I believe we should focus on knowing ourselves rather than obsessing about what the adversary is doing. If we bring that into a formal process, systematize that, then I believe we can make real progress, even in these difficult times. And thank you very much.